Hello everyone, my name is Doug Giannotti. I'm a client technical architect with IBM, and today I'm going to go over leveraging API keys with Maximo. We'll start with a brief description of what API keys are and why would we want to leverage them or use them within a Maximo integration transaction. Once that is complete, we'll transition over to the demo aspect where we will go through the API key lifecycle. That lifecycle includes creation of an API key, using that API key with the Maximo integration transaction, and finally revoking that key. Maximo 7609 introduced the foundation of leveraging an API key with an integration transaction. However, it was the Maximo 7611 patch that really opened the door and increased the functionality to viably use this as an authentication mechanism with an integration transaction. API keys are essentially tokens that can be used to make REST API calls into Maximo without needing to provide user credentials. API keys are created for a given Maximo user, and integration calls using those keys effectively work in the context of the user session. What this implies is that all of the user security permissions are respected through that API call. REST APIs invoked using API keys use a silent login. What this means is that there is no max session entry created. So essentially, you have a stateless connection to Maximo. API keys can be created or revoked as needed. Currently, there is a limit of one API key allowed per user. Lastly, each of these API keys may have an expiration time defined. That expiration time may vary depending on each of the keys. The expiration time is specified when the key is created. You can also have an API key with no expiration. That key can be used indefinitely until it is manually revoked. Okay, I talked a little bit about what an API key is. So let me briefly talk about why would we want to use an API key. So as Maximo has matured, we have added new ways to authenticate into the Maximo system. So we started with, we had one way, we had the Maximo native authentication, right? And that's when the username and passwords were stored within the Maximo system itself. Maximo 6 introduced the ability to have Maximo authenticate off a directory server. And that's when Maximo was reaching into the corporate directory server where, the username and password, it would check against that. If it was valid, it would let you into the Maximo system. Maximo 7.6, I believe it was 02, introduced the ability to authenticate off of SAML or OpenID Connect, right? So each of those mechanisms adds more complexity into the system as a whole. If you're using a SAML or an OpenID Connect authentication mechanism, those typically are more browser-based interactive, right? So you need to have do something at the browser level so that it has that interaction that will ultimately let you into Maximo. That becomes a little bit more complex when you are now doing an API call. So by leveraging an API key, we are essentially going to give you the ability to authenticate into Maximo, but bypass the mechanism of leveraging a SAML or an OpenID Connect or something with a browser-based authentication. So the API key mechanism simplifies the authentication process. By assigning a user an API key, that user or that integration transaction can leverage that key as the mechanism to authenticate into Maximo. Now that we have a better understanding of what API keys are, let's actually see this in action. So what we'll do here is we will go through the API key lifecycle. First thing we'll do is we will generate an API key for a given user. We will leverage that key to make an integration transaction into Maximo. Once that transaction is complete, we will go through and revoke that key so that it will no longer be valid. For the demo, we are going to be leveraging Postmen. going back to the scenario I described earlier, the first thing we need to do is we need to generate an API key for a given Maximo user. And to do that, we're going to start off by sending a post transaction. So what we're going to do is we're going to post to the MX API key, and we're going to pass over a body, and in that body we're going to have the username to associate to that API key. If I look at the headers, we're going to have to send over some header information as well. The first header we're going to pass over is our context type, so we're going to be saying application JSON because we're passing over a JSON body. We need to specify how we're going to authenticate into Maximo. Now, since we don't have an API key yet, we can't leverage that. So here I'm using Maximo native authentication. So based on that, I'm going to send over the maxauth header. And the value is going to be my base 64 encoded username and password. So I'm going to leverage that for this given transaction as the authentication mechanism. The last header I'm going to send over is something called properties. And what properties will allow me to do is get information back based on what I posted into Maximo. So instead of making a subsequent get call into Maximo, I can say properties and I can say fields that I want to come back. Lastly, let's look at the body that I'm sending over for this given transaction. I'm sending over two fields here. One is our user ID, and that's the user ID I want associated to this API key itself. And second is the expiration. So a -1 expiration means that the API key itself does not expire, and it'll be valid until I manually revoke it. So body's set, headers are set. My post is set to go to the MX API key. Everything looks good. Let's go in and send this transaction. Okay, transaction has been sent to Maximo. Maximo sends me back that information that I had within the properties header. So I'll get back everything that I requested. So here we can see my user ID, my expiration. But here is really what is the most important part of this transaction. This is our API key, and this is what we will use in our next transaction as the way to authenticate into Maximo. Now that we have successfully generated our API key, we can use this as the authentication mechanism going forward. So the next step, let's actually look at some more information about that API key. So what we'll do is we're going to do a get, and we're going to go to that same object structure that we went to before. We're going to go to the MX API key. From a parameters perspective, we're going to set our OSLC select, and we're going to set it to star. So we want all the information coming back from that object structure. Now, if we look at the headers, we are going to actually send over that API key itself. So we're going to use that as the authentication mechanism. So with that set, I'm going to do a get, and we're going to send this over. Now, what we have coming back to us is information about all of the API keys that I have associated to my various Maximo users. So we'll see down here, we have my Maximo user, and we'll see that API key that I use and I generated in the previous step. Now, what I'll need to take note of, need to take note of this API key token ID, because this is what I'll use later on when I want to revoke that key. I'll need to specify that key value. So 104, store that in my memory, and we'll use that later on. Next step in our scenario, we will leverage that API key to create a work order in Maximo. And to do that, we'll go over and we'll create a post transaction. And we're going to be posting to the MXWO object structure. So let's look at the headers. We are going to set our context type to application JSON. Our properties, those are what we want to get back when we do the actual post itself. So we'll get back WONUM, description, and site ID. And then we have our API key itself. So we're going to post that API key in there. And then let's look at the body of the transaction itself. So we're just sending over two fields. We're sending over site ID and we're sending over description. Since Maximo has an auto key defined for the work order number itself, we're going to just leave that as blank and let the auto key fill that in. That looks good. Our headers look good. Our URL is set to post, so we're all good. So let's send that transaction in. Okay, transaction received by Maximo. Maximo sent us back the information. So we see we got our description, our site ID, and our work order number. 1327. Okay, let's get a little bit more information about that work order. So we will do another get transaction. We will get information from the MXWO object structure. So we are just going to be getting a couple fields here. WONUM, site ID, description, status, etc., work order ID. Our work order number is 1327 and our site ID is Bedford. Going back to headers, we're going to populate our API key and we're going to send this transaction. And we are going to get more information about that work order itself. We have now completed all of our integration tasks leveraging that API key into Maximo. The final step in our scenario would be to go in and revoke that key for that given Maximo user. To do that, what we're going to do is we are going to send a delete request into the MX API key. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to pass over the key value, the ID value. We got that when we did our get to get more information on the key value. So if I go down here, we'll see my user, we'll see my API key, we'll see that token ID key. That's what I'm going to want to pass over. So it was 104. I'll come over here. I'll set this to 104. From a header perspective, I could do two things. I could leverage that API key one more time because it technically is still valid. However, once I do this transaction, that API key will no longer be valid. So I'm just going to switch over now and go back to using my native Maximo authentication. And once again, to do that, I'm going to set the header to max auth, and the value is going to be my base 64 encoded username and password. So once this is done, I'm going to send in this transaction. Now, once I do this, we're not actually going to get any information back. We're going to get back a 204 no contest. How we can validate that that key is no longer there is we can go back and do a get transaction against the API key object structure and look to see if that entry is no longer there. To do that, I'm going to go back to my transaction where I got more information on the API key. I'm going to do a get here, and I'm going against the MX API key. My parameters, I'm doing an OSC select. I want all the information. Now my header here, I'm going to switch that back to max auth because this API key is no longer valid. Put in my base 64 encoded username and password, and I'm going to send this transaction. Now once I do, this right here, this should disappear. And it does. So what that means is I revoked that key from my given Maximo user, and it's no longer valid. I hope this was helpful in giving more information on how to leverage an API key for a Maximo integration transaction. In the description of this video, I've also posted the full API documentation that is a living document. So as new features are added, the document is constantly changing. So I encourage you to go visit that when you're doing your Maximo integration transactions. Thank you and have a good day.